Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Brett Carollo, Carollo. He's been on my show many times, at least 15 or 16 times. We first started out talking about his excellent podcast. I will put a link to it, PsyOp Cinema. We've done a bunch of shows, movie analysis, things like that, a little bit about McGowan. And we've actually talked to an ex-Atomwaffen member together, but he also has other projects. He's not just one-trick pony, so to speak. He has what you'll see if you're watching this on Rockfin, Rumble, or X Twitter, is his foundation called Decoding Culture Foundation. And associated with the Decoding Culture Foundation is a magazine that he has up, and I will try to bring it up here. It's Cultural Engineering Studies. Yes, there it is. It's beautifully rendered online and it has a physical copy. So you can actually have something that won't get censored or taken off the internet. So if you'd like to buy it, it's a great magazine. A lot of great visuals, very well edited and formatted. But we've talked about issue 1, and this will be the second part of a newer thing, which is the NASA and Hollywood. It's a pretty long article, 30 pages. I read the whole thing. I have tons of notes. And I think it's going to kind of an important under-addressed kind of issue in our, certainly not in the mainstream media, which is state influence upon our culture in a larger sense, and specifically in NASA. And NASA as a whole, there's a whole series of questions and a lot of issues, but Brett can go into them in detail. So Brett, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, William. Always a great pleasure.
Yeah, congrats. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, as Thomas and I have been on the show many times, mostly as part of the PsyOp Cinema team. But here we're wearing a different hat, so to speak, or I am. The Decoding Culture Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that we run. I'm the Director of Research Operations. Cultural Engineering Studies is the official magazine of the Decoding Culture Foundation. We put out a print version that I was just holding up. You can buy for $30, but we make it free digitally as well. I mean, you can donate. And I've been doing this. I was on it. It's been about a year, right? I was on about a year ago talking about NASA and Hollywood. I did a part 1 article, which was kind of the preliminary article to part 2. It's kind of the gateway drug to part 2, I think, where I really present my findings. And in part 2, now that what you're putting up there is the earlier, before we had a professional designer come in, which I think is really cool. That's the early digital version of the magazine. We've had a professional designer come in and redo part 1 and part 2. Or do part 2 and redo part 1. But so I'm not going to go into all the stuff that I did in part 1, but I kind of have to recapitulate a couple of things just to give people a little bit of context for the discussion here. I'm not trying to ring my own bell, but I'm sort of the expert on the Hollywood NASA relationship. I mean, really almost by default, because even though I think people, I mean, almost, at least subliminally, like everybody recognizes that NASA has this massive relationship with Hollywood, and that NASA has this huge sort of publicity apparatus, that there's just not that much known about it. And with the DCF, one of the things we specialize in is the Hollywood DC relationship, the relationship between Washington DC and Hollywood. And much of that research has been done really in the last 20, 25 years, including by people like Matt Alford, whom I was just on with recently to talk about the interview I did about Gary DeVore. But other than this guy named Lawrence Seward that I'm going to mention, who is often thought of as a mouthpiece, I think he's a good historian in certain ways, but clearly he was captured by the Pentagon and the government in certain ways. Nobody really was doing this research or was in a position to do this research, as Lawrence Seward had all of the records. But so a lot of the research that's been done in Hollywood, DC since the early 2000s, though, has just focused on the Pentagon, understandably. I mean, we see like the recent sort of predictive programming stuff around like Top Gun, Maverick, and obviously there's a reason to look into that stuff, and also the CIA. But I thought we could fill in certain gaps by looking at agencies like Department of Homeland Security or NASA or even the FBI and stuff that are not getting enough focus. So I do FOIA requests. This is one of the things I do as Director of Research Operations. I do Freedom of Information Act requests, and I do them for the Pentagon and Army, Navy, Marines. I do all that kind of stuff. But I also have tried some kind of requests on the fringes. One of the things I got, for example, is for the ATF. I was able to confirm that they supported Tony Scott's Deja Vu film, and got photographs, got an unreleased press release that they had for that film and stuff. I understand nobody has ever gotten anything from the ATF on their entertainment industry collaborations, but I really focused on NASA. And as I talked about in that first episode, I was able to get some lists, and I was able to get some Space Act agreements. And Space Act agreements are NASA's equivalent of what are called production assistance agreements. And the Pentagon, it's when the agency enters into an agreement with a production company to give full support to a production, which we don't have to go through all the legalistic language, but basically it means that insofar as they portray that agency, the agency has control over how they're portrayed, which in a movie that's primarily portraying the agency means they control the production laws. They have script control over the production. In the past, researchers like Matt have been able to get script notes and things, but it's another subject. Now the government's really trying to shut down your ability to access those kind of things. So since last year, I've been able to get lists, and you can bring them up on the screen if you get a chance, for the lists of NASA. I've been able to get lists for every year from 2005 up to the present. Why is 2005 significant? Because a guy named Bert Ulrich has been the media liaison to Hollywood since 2005. He created the current office. Before that, it's a very murky situation, as I describe in the Part 1 article, in terms of what we know about Hollywood's relationship, or NASA's relationship to Hollywood, or vice versa. I've been able to get lists from 2005 up to the present, except 2021, which is interesting, because that's the year. You see, I was able to get, as I discussed in that last in the prequel to this, I was able to get in touch, or they put me in touch with Bert Ulrich, because I was making so many FOIA requests. And Ulrich tells me that they've lost his email in 2021. They lost all of his emails, he says. So he can't tell me why all of these collaborations, and I think there's like 700 or something included on these lists, and that's another document if you go into the lists, all of these lists of NASA collaborations, he can't tell me, other than when there's a Space Act agreement, what NASA did for the production. And he said, don't bother to FOIA the lists, because we're not going to give them to you. And second, all my emails were erased. And as I point out at the beginning of this Part 2 article, there's a pattern of erasures at NASA, right? The moon landing tapes, originals have somehow been erased and or copied over, and it's a bizarre thing for an agency that's all about high tech and being on the cutting edge of technology and stuff, right? But 2021 is also interesting because Ulrich tried to, when I was talking to Ulrich, he tried to downplay NASA's involvement. He said, maybe we just gave him some footage, whatever. It's no big deal. Like, get over it. And then I found this when he was on the official podcast of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. He's bragging on that podcast about how many collaborations there, which would be 147 total. That includes documentaries, TV shows, and I think about 25 feature films. He's bragging about the very thing he downplayed to me. Now, I sensed how slippery he was when I was talking to him, and that really confirmed it. He's saying the opposite on that podcast to what he's saying to me. Now, so I end that Part 1 article by saying, we can figure out a little bit about the pre-2005 NASA-Hollywood relationship, though, because Lawrence Seward, who is the gentleman who was the official historian of Pentagon-Hollywood relationship, he was commissioned by NASA to write a cultural history of NASA. And this was never published. And in fact, interestingly, and I have my own theories why, but this contract was terminated by the official historian of NASA at some point in the mid-'80s, sometimes around 1986. But in the course of researching this, I mean, he had a manuscript, and I guess he was maybe trying to get it published. He never did. Now, Seward, okay, so a little bit of background here. So
it's spell that name. It's a funny last name. It's
S-U-I-D,
yeah,
Lawrence Seward, S-U-I-D, okay? And the liaison between the Pentagon and Hollywood from 1949 to 1989, so like for 50 years, okay, the guy was a man named Donald Baruch. And Donald Baruch was friends with Seward, and they were close. He wrote letters of recommendation for him. He took him under his wing, and he gave Seward, nobody else, he gave no other academic researcher, he gave Seward access to all of his office's files. And as Matt talked about in the last time I was on, other academics were very frustrated because they were not given access to these files, and Seward kept them under wraps. And this is considered, low academic integrity and so on. And Baruch is the great nephew of Bernard Baruch, who's one of the most powerful Jewish financiers in the history of the country and is involved in introducing jazz music. So there's a lot of, cultural engineering and a lot of money, power and stuff going on here. Okay. But anyway, this manuscript, this NASA cultural history manuscript is on file at Baruch University, which I think is in New York. And I learned about this through like a blog post at Baruch University. And I wrote to them requesting the files pertaining to NASA and Hollywood. And they sent me 2 chapters of it, chapters 5 and 6, which were the 2 chapters of this cultural history of NASA written by Lawrence Seward that pertain specifically to Hollywood. And interestingly, they've ghosted me since then. I've asked them for the rest of the manuscript. I had Matt Alford ask them, and they've gone dark, but who knows? By the grace of God, they sent me the 2 chapters, which were very informative in terms of learning more about NASA's history to Hollywood. And so that's one of my main sources. Another source, though, is a clue that Bert Ulrich himself gave me. And Bert had promised, by the way, he said, stop making all these FOIA requests. It's just sort of bogging down the agency. I'll give you what we're going to give you. I'll give you the Space Act agreements. But I said, look, what else do you do besides Space Act agreements? You're not going to tell me. He kind of coughed up that, well, we do logo agreements, because anybody who uses, this is true before 2005 and it's true after 2005. Anybody who uses the NASA logo, technically they have to get permission of NASA. And there's a logo agreement. He said, I'll give you all of my offices. NASA. I think all they gave me was like Transformers the last night. So I just went back to FOIA-ing stuff. He wouldn't even give me the list. So I've gotten all those lists in the last year that I didn't have before. I've gotten them just through FOIA, because I really just don't think the guy, I'm saying this stuff because I don't think the guy dealt honestly with me. And I'm just coming
Probably not.
Insane.
Probably not.
Yeah. Well, he's Johns Hopkins University School of International Relations. And, that'll bring us quickly to the conclusion is that really, NASA is kind of an extension of the roundtable groups, right? In globalism and that sort of stuff. For people who don't listen to the whole episode, we'll just cut to the chase with that. But anyway, so that was another clue.
It's everywhere, right? I mean, it goes back to the Crown, back to the City of London, all this stuff. It's incredible how much influence they have on us.
Well, you see it partly through the messaging. So that kind of brings us to the prehistory of it. And Seward is, and I want to say this, Seward is, I say in my article that he's kind of unfairly maligned in some ways. In some ways, he's fairly maligned. Other ways, he's unfairly maligned. I think he's an honest historian. I mean, I went to the archives in Georgetown, which now are open. Now that he's died, you can go into his papers and you can see his stuff on the Pentagon. You can also look at his NASA stuff. And I went through every NASA related document that I could, and I got through almost everyone that I had time to find. Okay. And he interviewed a lot of people. The most important interview was probably the Julian Scheer interview, who was the head of media relations and the guy who made decisions about what movies and other things they would collaborate with and not collaborate with. So I went to Georgetown, right? And I looked over all of this stuff. So that's part of my source for, I guess, between the beginning of the agency and when he kind of cuts off at the end of the 70s, his research.
That's a nexus point too, Brett. Georgetown, literally the guy who wrote the book on the Anglo-American establishment taught there for Quigley forever, right? I think you mentioned him in your article.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no coincidence, right, that this is all at Georgetown University. Okay. But in that chapter 5 that I mentioned, he says, to understand the relationship between NASA and Hollywood, you have to look at it. It's an extension of the relationship between the Pentagon and Hollywood. And that's true in a lot of ways. Okay. And I'm not going to, I encourage people to look at part 1, because I talk about how Disney is deeply intertwined with the creation of NASA in an unbelievable way for people who want to look into that. But Seward focuses, I think, rightly on this whole UFO thing, is that, there are portrayals of space travel and of rockets and so forth before the existence of NASA, and the Pentagon was keen in many ways to collaborate with Hollywood on that, but in certain ways they weren't. So they developed a policy: we're not going to do UFO movies. Okay, there was a no UFO policy. But what's interesting are the exceptions to this rule. Okay, and The Day the Earth Stood Still is the sore thumb exception to this rule, because they decided we're not going to do UFO movies. For example, the Air Force said, we just spent, millions of dollars disproving that UFO flying saucers exist. Of course, we're not going to support movies that portray them. Now, The Day the Earth Stood Still gets Pentagon support because of Donald Baruch. And Donald Baruch decides, the reasoning that he gives, which is preposterous. He says the reason that we're going to support The Day the Earth Stood Still, they gave National Guard, they authorized the National Guard to be portrayed. We're going to give support to this film because in the event of an alien invasion, the National Guard would be involved. So we got to make him look good. Well, that would make it seem like you should support every single UFO flying saucer movie. On the face of it, right? That's just preposterous. And we're going to see more of this as we get into some of NASA's support that Seward himself couldn't understand, for movies like Capricorn 1, Marooned, Countdown, that just don't make sense because they mar the image of the agency. And Seward quickly perceived that this is somehow related to the UFO thing. It's in this chapter 5, okay? But that movie, to cut to the chase, because we only have a certain amount of time here, that movie is globalist propaganda through and through. And Robbie Graham, who wrote Silver Screen Flying Saucers, picked up on this, and even provided evidence that movie was in fact something like the original War of the Worlds with Orson Welles, was a kind of psychological test of how the public would react to this. It was a kind of psychological warfare test, if you will, that the CIA was involved in The Day the Earth Stood Still. And the article, I go into that. I was on Sean McCann's show recently. We talked a long time about that, so I don't want to go deeply into that. But it's globalist propaganda. Now, in part 1, I talked about Tomorrowland, and so we just see this pattern of NASA being involved with globalist propaganda. But let's fast forward then to the existence of the agency itself and its own actual collaborations, because Seward, in these interviews that he does with the PR people and the agency, he rightly, he's a good historian in his way. He asked them about 3 movies in particular that it just doesn't make sense that the agency would support. And those are Countdown from 1967, Maroon from 1969, and Capricorn 1 from 1977, I believe. Okay. And see, the model that Seward developed, which I think is too simplistic for the Pentagon's relationship with Hollywood, is that, look, they want to make the Army, Navy, Marines, they want to make them look good. They want to make us look good. That's why, like, a movie like The Day the Earth Stood Still didn't make sense, because it made the military look feckless. It made them look impotent in the face of an extraterrestrial threat. It made them look stupid and trigger happy. And why would they want to? And it's a movie that promotes globalism and the idea that the nation state should be obsolete and all this kind of stuff, right? That doesn't really make any sense on the face of it, why they would support a movie like that. Similarly, it doesn't make any sense why NASA would support Countdown, Marooned, and Capricorn 1, which is, I think, the movies that we should focus on, and the movies that Seward rightly focuses on himself. And the most important, there's the 2 most important documents in that Georgetown archive, and all of these, by the way, are up on the in our records section, because we make all of our records public. That's part of what our project is, and part of what my project is the Director of Research Operations, to make all of the documents pertaining to Hollywood, DC public. And when it comes to NASA, so it's in that folder, Lawrence Seward related NASA docs. The AMPTP memo that we can talk about is one of those documents. But the Julian Scheer, now, so some of the interviews had transcripts, some of them did not. I had to listen to them on cassette tape. The Julian Scheer one did not have a transcript, so I made my own notes and I've uploaded my own notes. So he confronts Scheer about these 3 movies, and before I get into that interview, we should talk about those 3 movies. So Countdown comes out in 1967. It stars Robert Duvall and James Caan. This is 2 years before the moon landing, and this is maybe the first really big feature film that NASA really works very closely on. They let them use, I think, Kennedy Space Center and all kinds of facilities. They're just Yeah, that's one of the ways that they participate. And that's one of the ways, by the way, I found out about various collaborations. You can just go to IMDb and look at what movies use NASA facilities. Apart from logos and Seward, you can look at Space Camp from 86, so forth, what movies actually filmed at NASA facilities. So clearly they use NASA facilities. Okay, so Countdown is a movie about they're trying to get to the moon, which we were supposedly trying to do, right? And the Soviets are trying to get to the moon too, and supposedly we're trying to beat the Soviets so they don't one up us like they did with the whole Sputnik thing. But we find out, this is in the movie, that the Soviets are going to get there first. They're weeks away. We're several weeks away. We're not going to make it. So what we're going to do, though, we have a backup plan. We're going to send an astronaut, James Caan, on a suicide mission just to get there first. He's probably going to die, but he's got a 50-50 chance of living. Maybe we can come rescue him, but at least he'll get there first. Okay. He gets there and the Soviet crew is already dead. So we lost the moon race. They're already dead. And then it ends with, he's probably already going to be dead. So the messaging is this is a Robert Altman film, by the way, terrible movie. And forgotten for this reason, really. So the messaging here, if it isn't obvious, it'll become obvious when we talk about these other films, or we talk about Marooned, is that, the space race is a bunch of nationalistic craziness, just like what the Dave Yerst's still saying about the whole nation state in itself. It's just a bunch of suicidal, nationalistic craziness. It's totally pointless. And it completely mars the image of the agency, right? The Soviets certainly aren't portrayed as bad guys or doing anything underhanded. We're portrayed as putting our own people in peril and being obsessed with victory more than we are with space travel. Then you get to Marooned. So 1969, same year as the moon landing. I think it came out before the moon landing. And in that movie, which has Gene Hackman and some other big actors, that's about the space station, which was supposed to be the next thing after the moon. And in that movie, the astronauts are already on the space station and something goes wrong and they're not going to be able to get back. So NASA is going to have to launch a rescue operation. The NASA rescue operation goes awry and they're not going to be able to save them. They're going to die. And the Soviets come and save the day. The Soviets are the heroes. I'm not making this up. People may have forgotten this movie.
This is at the height of the space race. I mean,
this is at the height of the so-called space race,
right?
Which I've learned since in the course of my research is phony in a lot of ways, because Sputnik they portrayed as a surprise. Oh my gosh, the Soviets got a satellite out there. Now they can nuke us. It turns out this was an international sort of consortium that was involved in that research. That was involved in that project, and we already knew about it. And they were trying to gaslight the public all along. And then you get 2001: A Space Odyssey in the midst of that, which I spend, you mentioned the article's 30 pages long. I spend a good deal of the article talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was extensively supported, and which is written by globalist Arthur C. Clarke. And
illuminist. He's totally illuminated.
And which in the making of that movie, which the U.S. Embassy in London, which is an outpost of the Anglo-American establishment, is coordinating the military-industrial complex and other support for it. Not only do you have members of the American embassy coming to the set of 2001: A Space Odyssey and naval research and all these attachés.
Mueller, there's pictures of Mueller with Clarke and Kubrick.
Yeah, but you have the Soviet embassy coming to visit the establishment. So it's globalism. And then Clarke writes 2010, which says out loud what 2001 is saying quietly with its portrayal of cosmonauts, which is that Clarke looks forward to cooperation between the U.S. and the USSR, and he thinks that the nation state is basically a sort of hidebound concept and an institution, and it needs to go. And this is what the upper echelons of NASA have been supporting all along. And Julian Scheer in the interview plays completely coy about this. He's asked point blank, again, to Seward's eternal credit, he's asked point blank, how do you support Countdown, Marooned, and Capricorn? Now, Scheer was there from 62 to 71, so he wasn't there when Capricorn 1 came out. So he's only really responsible for Countdown and marooned. But he pretends not to remember Countdown at all, which is totally preposterous, right? And then he starts to hem and haw about Marooned and trying to talk about Marty Caden, and it's a bizarre, people can read what he says, it's a bizarre answer that he gives, which probably says too much. It's that Marty Caden, who wrote the novel and who would continue to work with NASA on, was it the $6 Million Man and stuff like that, was just so connected that we had to do, and by the way, Scheer, I found a memo in another work where Scheer himself wrote that that Maroon reflects horribly upon the agency and we shouldn't support it. But then he won't say that to Seward. He's trying to pretend, oh, well, we support it because he says you have to see this to believe it. And it's in the AMPTP memo, partly. He says it was about free speech. He says they didn't want to censor productions. That's literally the answer that they give, that we would just work with anybody. And that didn't wash with Seward because he understood, of course, that the agencies are trying to protect their image. And is there any agency that has burnished its image more than NASA? Is there any more image conscious agency? But that is officially the explanation. Now, if you read that memo closely that you have up, what it really says, and who's making the decisions at NASA, I don't know that I don't know that it's Julian Scheer. I think it's coming from Washington itself. Okay. But what the memo really says is that any of the major studios, if they want to make a movie with us, we'll support them. Not just anybody, not just any Tom, Dick, and Harry who strolls in there. And you have to understand that the major studios were, pockmarked with intelligence people. Daryl Zanuck and people that I talk about are just working hand in glove with the CIA, their agency already. So they're already trustworthy, in a sense, in their way.
2001 ties into a modern events, actually, talking about it, because Minsky was the guy, I think, that they relied on, or they called something about Minsky. And Giuffre said she was sent to Marvin Minsky, who was at MIT. Who was still around. I mean, imagine that, being sent to some dirty old man associated with Kubrick. And the focus on children of Kubrick's undeniable. I was like, there was a post actually about Eyes Wide Shut recently on my social media, and they're like, they were going to make Eyes Wide Shut a story about a pedophile network. I'm like, that's exactly what it's about. That's how it ends. It ends it as a freaking, the pedophile, the kid walks off. I forgot her name. But Sean and I too, you mentioned Sean McCann of Eyes Wide, Wake the Dead, excuse me. But we've done a show on Clark where I read out that whole thing. It's totally suppressed. It was on, I think, the Times of London or one of these papers, but where you mentioned it in your article, where Clark admits to being a pedophile. He liked boys, but the article they had the goods on him. Basically, he was an NAMBLA member, and he had a freaking storage thing of his thing was boys, like he was into teens or something like that.
So why is this really key? Because 2001: A Space Odyssey is made with extensive support of NASA, and Arthur C. Clarke is the fulcrum of that support. Now, what's bizarre is that Julian Scheer says, and this is one of the ways, and I don't say this lightly, but Julian Scheer is a bold-faced liar. He says NASA didn't lift a finger to support 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's an insane comment.
They called it NASA East. You mentioned it in your article.
George Mueller called it NASA East, who was the head of the manned spacecraft program, who was traveling over there. There were NASA officials coming and going from the Borehamwood Woods studios. Fred Ordway, one of my biggest sources is Fred Ordway, both the interview that he did with Julian Scheer, where he says repeatedly that NASA gave us, you can see in the article, he says NASA gave us all kinds of support, anything we wanted. He was going in and out of photographing NASA facilities, which that really raised my eyebrows. Aren't those like high security facilities?
Right, good point.
And they were photographing them. We're going in and out of this. So Arthur C. Clarke, though, is the fulcrum, but that's how.
Yeah, but Clark, sorry to interrupt. Clark is involved in the moon landing, so he's involved in 2001. He narrates all this stuff about the moon landing. He's responsible for geosynchronous orbit and stuff that Musk is using today, but you can hear him narrating the moon landing. So he's in NASA and the moon landing, which I think is pretty much, in my opinion, fake. like that he helped fake it.
So the technical advisor to the main technical advisor to 2001: A Space Odyssey was a man named Fred Ordway, who was a NASA engineer. And Fred Ordway met Arthur C. Clarke at a convention in like the 50s before he even worked at NASA. But Arthur C. Clarke was a fixture at NASA. You have to understand this. I mean, one of the letters that Seward exchanged with Clarke brags that I know half the people on your interview list. I'm on a first name basis with half the people on your interview list. Scheer says that because one of the questions that Seward will often ask is, when the space program was becoming kind of unpopular in the 70s, people were losing interest. What did NASA do about that? And Scheer tells Seward about a meeting at Walpole Island that took place to discuss this problem. The only outsider at the interview, the only person who didn't work for NASA, was Arthur C. Clarke. Okay, but it's not just this, it goes beyond NASA. So not only is Arthur C. Clarke the person that's introducing, that's bringing together Ordway and Kubrick and Kurt Lange, who also ends up leaving NASA to work on this, but he's also this person who is the entree between Ordway and Kubrick and the military industrial complex. Okay, and I feel like I should read here from a little bit of the article just to give people a sense of this, rather than just ranting about this, and to look at a quote from Ordway here, because it's really just an amazing amount of access here. If I could just read this for a second.
Yeah,
okay,
please do.
So let me just read a passage here from the essay. Okay, so Ordway says we relied heavily on advice and material provided
you
by.
Just dropped off. Okay, so there
can you hear me?
Let me see my audios. Go ahead and keep talking.
Okay, so Ordway says, we relied heavily on advice and material provided by NASA, which contradicts Scheer. He says Clarke was instrumental in securing access to both. Clarke and I had a long session at the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Company in Bethpage, London on the 11th of March. This is when they're in pre-production before they've gone to England in 1965. The first of several visits designed to keep us current on progress with what was then called Apollo's lunar excursion module. And I write, the number of military, industrial, and other private contractors with government connections that assisted 2001 is simply stunning. And then Ordway writes, this is in his retrospective about the making of 2001, not the interview. I found myself visiting General Electric's Missile and Space Vehicle Department near Philadelphia on Discovery Propulsion, the Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, on deep space communications, the Whirlpool Corporation on Benton Harbor, Michigan, on food equipment to be used aboard Orion 3 and Ares 1B, Honeywell Incorporated in Minneapolis on a variety of vehicular controls, and IBM in Armonk, New York, and its Elliott Noyes contractor in New Canaan, Connecticut on all our computer sequences. Cooperation arrangements made from our New York base were later continued throughout production at the MGM British Studios and Boreham Wood, London. I had Matt Alford go to the Stanley Kubrick archives in London to get any documents he could on the NASA's involvement with 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that's an interesting side note to this whole thing too, because a lot of these documents should be like in the National Archives. They should be in the United States. They should not, the British should not have those at all. And the Stanley Kubrick, the Kubrick family and the Harlan family are sitting on these documents, and they do not let you make copies of them. They do not let you bring them out of there. You've got to get permission. And I put in I filled out all the forms and they didn't even get back to me. Okay, so all I have is this report from Matt Alford on this stuff, which we can look into some of this. It was very fascinating stuff, but that's how I had to get information out of them. But one of the things I found out pertaining to what I'm talking about now is that Dr. Ronald Smelt, who is the chief scientist and vice president of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, also participated. And so Clarke is involved in a lot of these visits. And then even after they come to England, and Ordway has apparently left NASA. Now, some people tell this story as if Ordway just left NASA all of a sudden to go work for Kubrick, but that's not really what Ordway says. At first, he was going back and forth between NASA and working for Kubrick, and then Kubrick asked him and Hans Kurt Lange to come on permanently as technical advisors, and so he left NASA. But he continued to have a relationship with NASA. NASA continued to give him access to their facilities, and he continued to come back to the United States and to go in and out. And NASA officials were going in and out. And Clark is a guy who's mediating all of this stuff, and a lot of the visits to these various military-industrial contractors. I haven't even mentioned the academic institutions, the anthropologists involved in this. Clark knew everybody. Now, to cut to the chase, what I get to in the article is, yes, Clark was a pedophile. And you have to wonder whether this access that they were able to secure didn't have something to do with that, in the way that, Jimmy Savile had access to the royal family and Margaret Thatcher and all of these people. So, yes, and I quote that article, which was, I believe, what was it, London Mirror, some article.
Right, yeah, something like that. Totally, you can't find it online anymore.
Yes, it's very hard to find online, except what you can find, though, is Clark's later response to that, where he says openly that the reporters are never going to work again. Then Prince Charles or whatever is going to get rid of them. And oh my gosh, it's just... And then that article, by the way, he's saying one of the most amazing things in the article is he was being asked about some unnamed Swiss pedophile who was then on trial in Switzerland, that supposedly you, Arthur, you went to parties with this guy. And Arthur says, yes, maybe I did go to parties with him. I knew this great chap who was in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and read this because everybody in the world should hear this about Arthur C. Clarke. I'm quoting from this article now. Clarke is said to have attended parties at the tycoon's home. That's the Swiss guy. When asked if he had, Clarke replied, quote, I may well have done. I mean, the very first man I met here, this is in Sri Lanka, of course, where he went to creep on boys. I met here in 1954, was a pedophile and made no bones about it. He was in intelligence in the army, a fantastic guy, unquote. They're just waving it in your face.
And Sean and I talked about that ping pong place, like a disturbing connection to Comet Ping Pong and Lolita. Is that these ping pong things, something's going on, that symbolism. It's in the movie Lolita with Kubrick, and these pedophiles like that. Like that ping pong place is still extant. Like you can still meet dudes there, is my understanding, or teens or whatever. But yeah, Clarke, he totally illuminated. His books have all the numerology in it, all the 9/11 all the illumination, 9/11 illuminate, and really one of the riddles and the mysteries of the monolith in 2001 is revealed in his book, which Kubrick pulled. This is kind of an interesting story about 2001. Kubrick pulled a fast one on Clarke and wouldn't let him publish his book right alongside the film's publication because Kubrick had some rights to it. So he intentionally undercut Clarke, and his film came out solo. But if you read 2001: A Space Odyssey, the size and dimensions, the height of the monolith is, of course, what number? 11. It's 11 feet tall. So the number of the New World Order, the number of the New Age, the number of magic, it's all there, yeah. He knew. There's giveaways, too, in his other books. Like I can do a whole show on that, where his numerology is all there. It's incredible. He knew a lot of that stuff.
Absolutely. If you want to get one of the most important documents that Matt got for us or summarized for us in the Stanley Kubrick archives, if you want to get that document up, where Matt's report, which is in our archives under miscellaneous, is that long range forecast study of Kubrick's. And it's not for nothing, right, that all of Kubrick's films after 2001 are basically about mind control, right, and about the cult that uses mind control. But the significance of 2001 in terms of this Anglo-American globalist establishment, the main significance of it is that it really articulates the religion, their sort of transhumanist religion, essentially, is what I make the case that's really the importance of this movie and what the aliens represent. And I actually think Suet is really spot on. I think in his interpretation of that. But I mean, Kubrick himself, I quote a very little seen 1980 interview where Kubrick himself kind of spills the beans on what the movie is about. He says, the idea was supposed to be that that is the astronaut who's taken into the monolith, he is taken in by godlike entities, creatures of pure energy and intelligence with no shape or form. They put him in what I suppose you could describe as a human zoo to study him, and his whole life passes from that point on in that room, and he has no sense of time. Anyway, when they get finished with him, as happens in so many myths of all cultures in the world, he is transformed into some kind of super being and sent back to Earth, transformed and made some kind of Superman. Now, it's a little bit small for me on the screen, but if you're looking at that document,
what's the name of it? Is it under? Is it in the folder for Kubrick?
Oh, no, it's in miscellaneous. So if you go to if you go back out to our main documents,
records, there we go.
Yeah, miscellaneous. There's the Alfred's report, and you scroll down. I think it's on page 3 down there. So Kubrick alludes to the idea of immortality, that there's no reason, if we don't nuke ourselves, there's no reason that we can't be immortal. Kubrick also, and this is evident from his remarks at the premiere of 2001, he also seems to really be buying into the extraterrestrial thesis, though, which Clarke never believed in. So you have to understand that aliens are a cipher of some kind. For Clarke, what they're a cipher for, all you have to do is look at, say, The Day the Earth Stood Still, another production of the Anglo-American globalist establishment. There's two ways to look at it, right? I mean, they're just a projection of the elites themselves. The idea that this is where there's an aspirational projection, as we're going to be these immortal, superhuman gods that direct evolution. Or, I mean, the most supernatural angle you can take to it, that you can give to it, is that this is people like Fred Hoyle, that essentially they've mastered time travel, which you see in stuff like Tenet and so on. The elites are obsessed with time travel, and that they're actually directing evolution from the future. And this is the future. This is the elites in the future, essentially directing their own evolution into these super beings. So this is the transhumanist, religion of the future. They're going to be. This is, you've interviewed the Collins brothers. I hope you have them on again. They're really the great expositors in some ways of this neo-Gnostic transhumanist religion of the future. It's there in Childhood's End. So the other disturbing dimension of this, and
the present, really, if you listen to Teal, I need to have Millery on and both those guys on, but he said recently, these guys are talking about the newest iteration of human beings.
They're just different flavors of the same ice cream, So now we have Teal and we have Musk, who are openly attacking globalism and the globalist establishment, but they're really technocratic transhumanists who may be in some ways challenging the old paradigm, but they're really, again, just a different flavor of the same ice cream. We're just getting this is all cryptocratic politics, really. Like this isn't real in the way people think.
They have to rebrand it with same concepts, but new words that people don't have a negative response to. They want to make it look positive.
Yeah. And I mean, to their credit, okay, so in 2001, and this was in the original script, that the Star Child actually nukes the Earth, okay, at the end, and this is in the novel. And then Clarke would later say, why would this future being save the Earth? We're so bad, we're so evil. We're all familiar with this stuff, right? From the climate agenda and all the rest of it, right? They hate these are the elites, or these Anglo-American globalist elites are psychopathic. They hate humanity. They want to destroy the planet. Teilhard de Chardin, by the way, I found out my research, he looks forward to just having the planet and all humanity destroyed when the super beings come along. Not just humans, but the planet itself.
Just annihilate the planet. Wow. And this is a priest. He's like a priest too, right?
In the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still with Keanu Reeves, which, by the way, was supported by NASA and the Department of Defense.
2008, right?
No controversy about it anymore. Them all supporting it. And that movie, Klaatu, the alien, hasn't come to save humanity. He's come to save the Earth from humanity and to destroy the planet.
That's total sustainability right there. That's King Charles III.
And it's only natural that the Pentagon would want to support a movie like that, right? That makes a lot of sense, right? Yeah. But
I call this the age of annihilation. I think they're just getting ramped up. Like these millions dead in Gaza, Ukraine, the COVID. They're used to the kill now. That's it. That's what's really scary, is that sometimes, like if you take World War II as an exemplar, or World War I, really, it's like, okay, we've been bloodied. Like, let's go bigger. Like that's what they did in World War II. Like, holy smokes.
Yeah. So the other thing the other wrinkle that's very disturbing, to go back to the Clarke PDO stuff, if you look at this document, there are illusions, and perhaps more than illusions, to mind control there, where Clark talks about superhuman. I can't see the document in front of me now, but he's talking about children on the moon and superhuman children and
predicts children on the moon and discusses religious mythologies, quoting Sagan,
twinning experiments and types of coma that will time travel through types of coma. So Kubrick hasn't figured it out yet. He will, but it's mind control is what's in the background of all of this. And in Childhood's End, Clark's novel, all of this this is in the early 50s, right? What is 51 is Clark's Childhood's End. This idea that the overlords, who are really the reference of the fallen angels, I mean, they literally appear as devils now, are coming to take our children and basically make everybody else is obsolete. Only the children now can be evolved into the future state, which is, in a sense, is a metaphor, right, for the generational warfare dynamics that are being programmed. But they're going to have psi superpowers, and they're going to be taking over. The overlords are going to take over their education and are going to direct their evolution. You have to understand, insofar as this pertains to NASA, NASA's involvement with all of this, you have to understand this in the context of movies that NASA is going to support, like Flight of the Navigator. Okay, so that's kind of the next thing I wanted to come to. Like, if it's astonishing that NASA would support, and we know they did support Countdown, Marooned, and Capricorn 1. And if you don't know, Capricorn 1 is a movie where there's a fake Mars landing, or a fake Mars expedition. They can't do it, so they have to get this is supported by Mars. They let them use Marshall Space Center. Okay, if you don't know this movie, they can't do it, so they're going to have to fake it for the cameras. The astronauts have to be involved in the fakery. Then when the re-entry vessel the fake re-entry vessel burns up, the astronauts realize that they're going to have to be killed to keep up the hoax. The rest of the movie is about the NASA administrator having them hunted down and killed to keep up the hoax. Natural that NASA would want to support a movie like that. Of course, by the way, this is in the AMPT memo. Unlike the Department of Defense, NASA doesn't want its name in the credits. So people wouldn't have known that NASA supported these movies. They didn't want people to know, but they did. Okay. Now, if that's weird, why does NASA support Flight of the Navigator? Some of your audience will know Flight of the Navigator, about a kid who supposedly is kidnapped by a spaceship. This is all and I'll substantiate this. This is sort of thinly coded PEDO stuff. Is kidnapped by a spaceship and brought 8 years into the future, where then he's brought to a NASA, quote, research facility to be experimented upon, hooked up to the whole MK headgear. How do I know that NASA supported that movie? Well, as I said, the NASA logo. And not only do and if it's the real NASA logo, right, not a knockoff logo, as Bert Ulrich told me, and it is the real NASA logo. And one reason I know it's the real NASA logo, it's the worm logo that they were using in that period, is because it's juxtaposed with the bicentennial logo, which was made in the same period. And it's very weird to me, and I still haven't figured this out. Why do you see the bicentennial logo in Flight of the Navigator, a Disney movie from 1986? I was just rewatching Space Camp, which also comes out in 1986, and which used the facilities in Huntsville, Alabama. Okay, the real space camp. So obviously it was supported by NASA. And for some reason, one of the very first shots shows the bicentennial logo on a NASA facility. This is 86, right? And the Navigator is supposed to take place between 78 and 86. Why is the bicentennial logo there? I don't know. That's another issue. But really the next thing, I don't know. Have you seen Flight of the Navigator, William?
No, but it's interesting. You mentioned Ordway because he died in Huntsville, Alabama. Like, he was there the whole time. So this guy, long term, he also wrote books with
Von Braun.
Yeah.
Oh, he was a NASA guy. Yeah, he was a NASA guy all the way. Yeah, there's no question 2001 was fully supported by NASA, given extensive support. So we can put that to rest if anybody.
I've seen pictures of Flight of the Navigator. I have not watched it in this whole thing, but I've seen the pictures of the, like you showed in your article, of the pedo symbol going up the stairs into the UFO or whatever.
Well, it's an extraordinarily disturbing film. I covered it in a premium episode for PsyOp Cinema. I mean, I did a whole episode on it, and I used a lot of my notes on that.
Is that on Patreon?
Yeah, it's a Patreon episode for PsyOp Cinema. I used a lot of my notes on that in writing the section of this NASA Hollywood Part 2 article where I discuss Flight of the Navigator. But it's extraordinarily disturbing because if you studied these monarch cinema, as I call it, these monarch mind control films, it's a very obvious example of that. And there's very obvious sort of coded references to pedophilia. First of all, you have a boy walking in the woods by himself who's abducted by a spaceship, which is then voiced by Pee Wee Herman, Paul Rubens, who then is going to be convicted in 2002 of possessing child pornography. The movie
And
is
years around kids and stuff, like weird.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to pick on the director because he's a gay guy, because all these gay people are involved in the production, but they're really creepy looking. And in the making of the movie, Life After Navigator, Tony Urbano, who's involved in the puppeteering and stuff, says that this alien menagerie on the ship, one of the creatures they were joking, they call it a sex room. Everything looks extraordinarily phallic. The whole spaceship, it interacts with him as a phallic orb, as you can see, which is obviously supposed to be phallic. The kid who's in the movie was obviously traumatized by his time, and how he ends up in drug rehabs and everything like that.
You showed Drew Barrymore. I think it's the same thing. Like, she was out partying and
and Drew Barrymore's young astronaut. They launched the Young Astronauts program with Drew Barrymore. It's Ronald Reagan and Drew Barrymore are out in a press conference announcing the young. So NASA's relationship to children, their obsession with children. I mean, I remember being in. I mostly went to public schools, but I was briefly in a private school in Baton Rouge when I was in kindergarten, first grade. And I remember NASA was sending us stuff in the mail and working us up to, we were all going to take a field trip to NASA when we were in the 5th grade, and all of these different programs, these school programs and stuff that NASA was involved with.
Get them young. I had friends in Model UN. They want the kids young, man. They want them young and impressionable. Just like communism or whatever. Even I think Nazism had a similar quote, like, get the kids young.
And the relationship between Disney and children goes without saying, and Disney and NASA were the partnership there was part of creating NASA, itself. So this movie, Flight of the Navigator, which is distributed by Disney, is a co-production with Disney, and it involves this kid who's supposedly abducted by a spaceship when he's walking alone in the woods, and he goes 8 years into the future, and some of this stuff is just clearly kind of coded trauma and trauma regression and stuff like that. And then he's taken to a NASA research facility, more or less against his will, and where he's experimented upon. But the spaceship is also there. And so with the NASA people are trying to get star maps out of his head, and your listeners who have familiarized themselves with the monarch literature, they know about all of these ideas of computer programming in kids' heads and all this computer language. And there's other movies in the 80s that I reference, including Explorers, with River Phoenix that has this stuff, which also apparently was supported by NASA because it's got the NASA logo all over it. Has this stuff. So the spaceship that's communicating with him telepathically, because he's got, psi because trauma gives you superpowers, right? It's the theta traumatic superpowered kid. And the spaceship wants to help him break out, and he's going to break the spaceship out. So he gets in the spaceship, and weirdly, the spaceship straps him into a seat, which looks just like the seat that he's in the NASA facility. So this looks like a sort of coded dissociation fantasy. And the spaceship is embodied by the voice of Pee Wee Herman, which calls itself Max, and is playing Beach Boys music and all kinds of pop culture, which mirrors when he's in the facility. When they have him in his private room, they encourage him to wear NASA merchandise and to watch all of the latest pop culture programming and to catch up on what's cool. What's going on here is you have an example of what I call revelation of the method. They're indoctrinating and mind controlling at a lower intensity the child audience of the movie, even as they depict the mind controlling of the child. This itself is a pattern that I found with NASA and NASA supported movies. I mentioned this movie called Future World in 1976. People might not know, which is a sequel to Westworld, where which used Johnson Space Center as the control room within the Future World Westworld facility. People know Westworld, right? As people go into an environment where it's robots and it's all simulated, right? In Future World, the sequel to this, they've created other worlds besides Westworld, and the titular Future World is where you can go up to the NASA space station, but it's all fake, and they're actually using Johnson Space Center as the control room, which is supposed to be where we see the real space travel, showing you fake space travel, which can be real. And sorry if I'm it's coming out like a fire hose, but all of this really brings us to the most recent NASA collaboration, 2024's Fly Me to the Moon, which is a full-on Space Act agreement that NASA signed between the production of Fly Me to the Moon and NASA. So I think there's only been like less than a dozen Space Act agreements that I have between 2005 and now. And a Space Act agreement means it's a full support of NASA, and it gives them creative control over all portrayals of NASA, which in a movie like Fly Me to the Moon, which is about NASA, basically gives them full control over the movie. So Fly Me to the Moon is about this PR lady played by Scarlett Johansson who worked for NASA, and she's approached by a deep state henchman portrayed by Woody Harrelson, who blackmails her because of her dark past and misdeeds that she's done and deceptive stuff she's done that are unnamed with the in the advertising and PR industry, telling her, you're going to participate in filming a fake moon landing. And NASA's fully supporting this. Just like Capricorn 1, you're going to support the filming of a fake moon landing in case the real moon landing goes awry. We're going to have a fake one on tap. Okay, so the first thing to point out here is that what's going on with Capricorn 1, with Future World, this movie is NASA is and their partners in the entertainment industry are showing you that whether or not the moon landing and space travel and the rest of it are real, even if it wasn't, they can fake it. They can show you. They have the power, right? They're showing you their power. This is a psychological warfare technique. This is right out of Michael Aquino and Paul Valalai's From PsyOp to Mind War, okay? Second, this is very key. In the movie, the project to stage a fake moon landing is called Project Artemis. Now, Artemis is the sister of Apollo, so that's the sister program. Well, it just so happens that the current real, quote unquote, real moon landing program of NASA is called Project Artemis. So get this, they name a fake moon landing program in the movie after their real, quote unquote, moon landing program in real life, in the context of showing you the power of them to control your perception and imagery. Okay, these are
power over reality. That is an occult concept. I think
Yes.
you mentioned it in your article. And Artemis is the sister of Apollo, right? So
yeah,
it's intentional.
and
There's a lot more we can talk about, Brett.
Yeah.
I got to wrap it up. We're at the hour mark. Where can people find your article? And is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
Sure. Well, they can find the article at the you'll probably put the link up, but decoding-culture.com, and then there's a little sublink to Culture Engineering Studies 2. We have 3 sample articles up, including the Matt Alford interview I did on the Gary DeVore article, the Collins Brothers article, the feature article for the issue, which really focuses on religion and transhumanism, and then my NASA and Hollywood Part 2 article. We'll get the whole thing up digitally eventually, but if people want to support us, there's a link to buy the magazine for $30. There's a discount if you buy Cultural Engineering Studies #1, which came out several months back, and #2. You can support us in other ways.
Patreon. Go to Patreon, guys. You have a lot of content on Patreon, so we'll put a link to PsyOp Cinema's Patreon.
And PsyOp Cinema, you can support us on
One
there.
of the interesting things that even this may not even pertain to NASA is how many of those old films have mind control themes in them, 60s, 70s, 80s, that people didn't notice at the time. But it's pretty remarkable, yeah.
Well, so I'm tempted in conclusion. I get really hyped up about this. I mean, I spent so much time researching it. As I said, I went to the Georgetown archives. I've done all these FOIA requests. I had Alfred go to the the Kubrick archives. I've been working on this, and I hope other people will pick up the work. I'm kind of moving on to other things besides NASA Hollywood. So I hope other people will pick up on this work and get enthusiastic about it. I'm tempted to go into Pink Floyd and the Maroon thing, but Hollywood has been playing. I've just given you a few examples of the mind games that NASA has been playing on us. And so I don't know, I don't have an opinion on whether the moon landing is real or not. I just know that NASA is partly responsible for the moon landing hoax theory and playing around with it. And this Fly Me to the Moon is just a jaw-droppingly obvious example of it, but I show other examples of it in the article as well.
Yeah, I think I'm going to watch Capricorn 1 again. I mean, it's kind of made right after the so-called moon landing in 69, so it's not that much time after 77. Features OJ and it's something else. But people, check this out. I'll put all the links in there. And again, it's Brett Carollo, Carollo, and PsyOp Cinema, and then also Decoding Culture, Engineering Studies. Well, it's Decoding Culture Foundation. And then the two articles are in the two versions, issue 1 and 2, of Cultural Engineering Studies. So thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, William. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, let's do that.